Two. Oh, okay. Yep. You can hear me. Hi, everyone. We are about to begin. So if you could settle down, come get your seats, perhaps stock up on pizza if you want to. Um, yeah. And let's get into it. If it's your first time here, can you please raise your hand? All right. Awesome. A few newcomers. Thanks so much for coming. Round of applause from Jason for the newcomers. Amazing. All right. He's so happy you're here. No, for real, thanks for coming. My name is Mario, and welcome to Trajectory Labs. We are a nonprofit work or co-working and event space. Our mission is to facilitate Toronto's contribution to the biggest challenges from AI. And one of the things we do is almost every Tuesday and Thursday, we do some sort of event like this where we get some expert coming in teaching you about AI safety, in some capacity. If you need to use the washrooms, just go out the glass doors and come back in. Regarding questions to this presentation, you're totally okay to ask Jason very quick clarifying questions while he's giving the presentation, but he's going to have a spot about halfway through, is that right? And at the end for more in-depth questions. In-depth questions are not monologues, though. So if it's going to take you more than 2 or 3 sentences to ask your question, maybe draft it once or twice before you ask it. If you have like ideas you want to share with the group, we have just informal discussion afterwards. That's for that kind of stuff. But yeah, without further ado, I'm really excited to welcome Jason Young, what information do you want them to know about you? Okay, Jason's going to introduce himself, but we're really, really excited to have him here. Yeah, big round of applause for Jason.
Thank you. Am I standing in the right place? Is this a good place for the video? Yeah? Okay. Oh, hello. Gotta get the clicker. Yeah, I'm Jason Young, and I'm a member here at Trajectory Labs. I am a geopolitical analyst that focuses on the intersection between frontier AI and international security, which is like a very small niche, but it's like growing, especially every month it kind of grows more important. So yeah, my presentation here today is about frontier AI deployments in the US military. And by, frontier AI, I mean like the big companies that do the cutting edge AI like OpenAI, Anthropic, X, and Meta. Meta's in there too. It's just so I can get a feel for the room. Who follows international politics a lot? Okay. And who's followed international politics for like that's like your thing, like you followed it for a while, like you follow sports, kind of. Okay, nice. Okay, excellent. Okay, this is very good information to know. Oh, nice. So basically, this is a presentation version of a my first Substack article, which took me about a month and a half to research and write. And I always like giving presentations because it allows me to present it in a different format. You can, I mean, I'll have the QR code at the end too if you want to read the article and subscribes. So I'd like to bring up the iceberg analogy here in terms of my discussion. Like, I can list out the frontier AI deployments, which have been announced in the last like 8 months, and there's been, it's steadily been growing. But it's just listing the announcements themselves without the context. It's the context that's important. So in the this will probably be the least like technical policy talk I think of Trajectory Labs so far. It's going to focus a lot on the history of geopolitics, society, stuff like that. So we're really focusing on understanding and contextualizing recent frontier deployments in the U.S. military. And the real story is really a story of change over the last decade, even further, in Washington, in Silicon Valley, and across the world, really, mostly involved with China's rise and expansion. So just to set this up, I'd like to begin just by juxtaposing 2 years in time, like 2018, 2017, that time frame, and this year, 2025. So back in 2018, in response to Google securing its first military AI contract with Department of Defense, DoD, Google employees staged protests, they had walkouts, and they eventually pressured Google management into not renewing that contract. 3,000 Google employees actually wrote an open letter to Sundar Pichai, the Google CEO, and in it, they stated Google should not be in the business of war. We believe that Google should not be in the business of war. Therefore, we ask that Project Maven, which was the name of that project, be canceled, and Google draft, publicize, and enforce a clear policy stating that neither Google nor its contractors will ever build warfare technology. Now jump to this year. Then this was just in July, when the U.S. DoD awarded $800 million to Anthropic, Google, OpenAI, and xAI to build advanced AI systems for military purposes, including AI agents. Also earlier this summer, we saw the first swearing-in ceremony of former tech execs into the U.S. Army Reserve. They're part of what's called Detachment 201, which is the U.S. Army's Executive Innovation Corps. And so these guys are like two former OpenAI employees or execs, one from Meta and one from Palantir. Now let's jump back to 2017, when Palmer Luckey, who is the inventor, or who is the inventor of the Oculus VR headset, and the former head of Facebook VR, was fired for giving a $9,000 donation to the Trump campaign in 2015, I guess 2016, 2015. And Silicon Valley has historically been dominated by Democrats, including tech companies. And back to this year, in January, at Trump's inauguration, where Mark Zuckerberg and the other tech execs stood really awkwardly beside each other and showed their support for President Trump. Now the question is, what are the difference between the 2 years? What are the forces that occurred that led to this change? How did this happen? So at this point, I like to present my conclusion just in the beginning, just so you know where I'm getting at, and to frame the rest of the discussion. So my preliminary conclusion from this preliminary research paper is that between the years 2018 and 2025, the relationship between Washington and Silicon Valley went through a major structural change. These changes are due to geopolitical, societal, and institutional changes in the U.S. and around the world, really. And the main point of this is that there were two formally separated systems of industrial growth and power. This is the military-industrial complex and the tech-industrial complex. And now they have been joined into one thing. They were formerly separated, and now they're joined. And it's upon this superstructure that frontier AI is being deployed in the U.S. military. And the key to understanding the implications of this is basically understanding where it's been to know where it's going. So just to give you a quick rundown of the military industrial complex based in Washington, D.C. This is kind of the structure that President Eisenhower warned about when he left office in 1961. It is an interconnected system of power which forms the basis of U.S. military power since World War II. The Department of Defense up there will contract large defense companies called defense primes to develop military systems. Now, these defense primes are Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon. They're pretty familiar to those of you that follow this kind of stuff. They make everything from fighter jets to ballistic missiles to armored vehicles to submarines. And in turn, they actually have a powerful lobby in Congress, and they lobby Congress for legislation that's more favorable to defense, and they lobby them to appropriate more money into the U.S. Department of Defense. Through every year, this funding is done through a what's called the National Defense Authorization Act. Yeah, NDAA every year. So and this kind of goes into a nice triangle here. This is the tech industrial complex that most of us who are familiar with tech are more familiar with, based out of Silicon Valley. And you basically had the formalization of this structure during the dot-com bubble in the 90s. You have venture capitalists who will fund promising startups. Most of those startups will fail, but the ones that are some are successful, and they either scale and they do an IPO, or they get acquired by one of the big tech companies. And if they get acquired by the big tech companies, the VCs get paid back, and everyone's happy, and the whole cycle begins again. And the VCs and the startups actually also function as like an outsourced R&D for the big tech companies. And the relationships between these three entities, classification of entities, are pretty well known. And this is a structure that has powered American tech innovation in Silicon Valley for pretty much the past 30 years. Due to changes in the past 10 years, these two systems are now connected into one super complex. That is the thesis of my research. It's still very early days in this connection of these two systems, but this system will develop further over time. But for now, I'd like to explore like the forces that led to this connection. So I'd argue that a series of interconnecting forces in the last 10 years, maybe even further than that, led to this change. But mostly I'll focus on the last 10 years. So yeah, so geopolitical change, we have international geopolitical change, you have societal change in Silicon Valley, and then you have institutional change in Washington, D.C. And they all inform each other. So starting with geopolitical change, we can actually go back a little further to the last 25 years. I can talk about this with more historical context, simply because most of my early career was doing this stuff, so I can speak out of experience. And when I'm talking about geopolitical change, I'm talking about from the US point of view and what they identify as challenges and opportunities, at the time and in the context of other countries and the international system. So if we start in the time after 2001, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, this was the so-called War on Terror era. Shortly after 9/11, President Bush declared a war on terror, and the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2001, and Iraq in 2003. And for the entire decade, the entire 2000s, the U.S. was embroiled in two separate counterinsurgency wars. Counterinsurgency wars meaning you're not fighting like another state, you're fighting like a band of like terrorists or guerrilla fighters in the mountains. It's like an asymmetric war, as they say. And they had to adapt their entire military into fighting this kind of war, like an insurgency in like a mountain, which requires it's a lot of helicopters, special operations, intelligence gathering. Like it's a very different style of warfare than conventional warfare. This is also what kind of led to the birth of drone warfare. At the time, the earliest drone warfare was American deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, because you can have a drone up in the air for a way longer than you can have a fighter jet for a way less cost, and the drone could be piloted by a guy in Vegas, which is what happened. They actually had like centers where people like pilots would pilot these drones in Afghanistan from Vegas, like attached to satellite communication. The war in Iraq lasted until 2011. And the war in Afghanistan lasted until about 2014. I know there was a chaotic final withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, but the bulk of US forces were gone in 2014. So what characterizes this time from the US point of view, or from I guess anyone's point of view, is that it was a unipolar time, in the sense that like the US was undeniably like the strongest military and economic force in the world, with no real challengers at the time. So there was a stability in that. Around the early 2010s, there started to be a recognition that while the US was bogged down in these wars that didn't seem to end, China was making major moves to develop its military. Now, China had built its economic foundations in the 90s, especially after its entry into the World Trade Organization. And they really started to build momentum in the 2000s as their manufacturing sector grew into like a world-class industry. This economic and manufacturing base is what allowed them, starting in the late 2000s, to embark upon like the greatest military expansion of any country in modern history, the greatest buildup. And this caused alarm in Washington. And in 2011, President Obama announced the U.S. pivot back to Asia, even amidst like still being bogged down in these wars. The pivot to Asia meant that the U.S. military had to be restructured from being like good at chasing down terrorist groups in mountains to be good at fighting a conventional war again. And every conventional war is different. A war in Asia, especially involving China, would be like a naval war and an air war. Whereas during the War on Terror, it was mostly like a ground-based army war, a lot of armored vehicles. The shift from War on Terror to great power competition with China was not just a simple urge to maintain hegemony, although that was obviously a part of it, but it was also, they were getting concerning signals from their allies in the region, like Japan, South Korea, Australia, that they were right on the doorstep of the Chinese military buildup. So just to give you a sense of the scale, not only was China catching up to the US in military hardware, in some areas they were actually outbuilding the US. This is a graph of number of ships in the US-Chinese navies. And China had surpassed the US building. This is the Chinese line, this is the US line. They had surpassed building their number of ships around like 2015. Yeah, China put a lot of investment into conventional ballistic missile capability with the idea that if something would happen in Taiwan, if the US wanted to intervene, basically China could just blanket the area in missiles and that would overwhelm the anti-missile system the US had. They called it this is called the A2AD, Anti-Access Area Denial System. It wasn't just the military modernization. China's growing economic size and influence kind of changed how it acted on the international stage. 2010s were a time of aggressive, assertive Chinese diplomacy. This was known as Wolf Warrior diplomacy, named after the popular Chinese movie franchise, which I've actually never seen. I can never bring myself to watch this one. Basically, I hear it's like Chinese Rambo, pretty much. This is what I understand. But basically, this conduct was one of the reasons for the souring of public relations between the West and China during the 2010s. This was also the time of like a number of international controversies involving China. I think the top one being the Uyghur genocide, when the international reporters would ask Chinese officials about this, and they would push back extremely aggressively and accuse them of being like Western propaganda. I always felt that Wolf Warrior diplomacy was like, it was like George Orwell plus like a disapproving father vibe. This guy, I forgot his name, but he was like kind of the poster child for Wolf Warrior diplomacy, which ended kind of in the late 2010s. But overall, this period was marked by alarm in Washington at China and the recognition of the need to really reorient towards a competitor who could overtake them. So keeping that all in mind, let's just put a pin in that for now. And let's move on to discuss like the second force, which is societal change in Silicon Valley. So Silicon Valley in the beginning was like tightly integrated with the US military. There was a so-called semiconductor era from the 50s to 70s. They were dominated by, they were centered around the US military in terms of their production and demands. It was the 80s and 90s that this gradually shifted away into the commercial space with the advent and development of the personal computer. From what I've read about this time, it seems like the energy of the hippie movement in like the 60s and 70s profoundly influenced Silicon Valley and remained a permanent fixture of its culture. You can remember this famous quote that is associated with Steve Jobs, although he didn't say this, but it was associated with him, and how he came up with Apple while in an orchard on LSD. I once read that Silicon Valley combines the openness and values of the hippies with the upwardly mobile, can-do ethos of the yuppies, and that seems about right. So since the 80s, Silicon Valley culture was open, creative, entrepreneurial, progressive, and very anti-establishment and anti-military, especially after the Vietnam War and especially during the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it was in this environment, it was like a fertile environment for like, the expansion of more radical progressive ideas in the 2010s of the activism of the era. The 2010s saw a wave of progressive activism around race and gender clustered around the killings of young black men in the US, which forced a re-examination of structures of power and what activists saw as institutional racism. This was also the time of Me Too, when it was revealed how the movie producer Harvey Weinstein had used his power and position to sexually assault many women, and it sparked a debate about gender dynamics in the workplace. The activism led to like an acceleration of diversity, equity, inclusion practices, and anti-racism training, and things like anti-racism training, which included a lot of implicit assumptions derived from like postmodernist theory. That's a whole other presentation. Oop. And this dynamic was exacerbated by the election of Trump won in 2016, when activists felt like they needed to kind of go harder in just to fight against what they saw Trump's like, what they saw, to fight harder against the racism and sexism that he represented for them. So the intensity of this era's activism led to like a lot of workplace debate and tension, and it moved the barometer in what was the acceptable discourse at work, like the words that could be said, the jokes that could be made. It moved sharply to the left, which alienated. Silicon Valley was originally not a conservative place, but it really alienated them at the time, and it also alienated a lot of centrists. Yes. So around this time, like you start to see articles in publications about the suppression of conservative values in Silicon Valley. This one's called "The Secret Republicans of Silicon Valley." Basically, it talks about how like you had to hide your views at all, and like you couldn't go against the dominant. People they criticize what they called as the Silicon Valley monoculture. Palmer Luckey's firing happened during this time after he made that donation to the Trump campaign. When he was the head of the Facebook VR. Afterwards, he actually started. It was after he got fired here that he started one of the first defense tech companies in Silicon Valley called Anduril, which now is like a leader in like autonomous warfare. They focus on drones. So let's put a pin in that as well, and move on to the final driver of change, which is institutional change in the Department of Defense, the DoD. So as I introduced earlier, this is the military-industrial complex that underpinned U.S. power since World War II. This complex does not really let new players in, and as a result, like all systems, it kind of stagnated, and especially in terms of innovation. And by the 2010s, it was not performing that well, especially with China outbuilding the U.S. in ships and missiles, but in many other facets as well. Recognizing that the U.S. military was not able to harness the innovation of Silicon Valley, DoD set up a special unit inside Silicon Valley called the Defense Innovation Unit that would help bridge this gap. The unit basically would identify technologies that DoD could use and also help tech companies navigate the sprawling Washington bureaucracy. Essentially, this was the beginning of the military tech industrial supercomplex. And this unit had a very tough time in the early years, given that most of Silicon Valley was pretty hostile towards it. But it also faced a tough time in Washington as it tried to create new ways of operating in like a very set in its way military industrial complex. And it had a really tough job of bridging two cultures. The one in Silicon Valley of move fast and break things, and the one in government of like move slow and do your due diligence. At this point, I'd like to ask if there's any questions. Okay, I'll go forward. So this basically all comes to a head in 2017. So let's recall the drivers of change. You got the US pivot towards China, you got the rising activism of Silicon Valley, and then you have the establishment of the Defense Innovation Unit. In 2017, China's State Council releases the plan called the New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan. This was under Chinese President Xi Jinping's direct guidance. And the plan calls for China to be the world leader of AI by 2030. Naturally, this caused alarm in Washington and at Department of Defense. At DoD, this accelerated efforts to adopt tech into the military. This was the context for which Project Maven was announced. The formal name of this project was the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Sectional Team, and its formal purpose was to use commercial AI to build a system to classify the massive amount of drone footage that the U.S. had from the War on Terror, in order to have like an automatic AI-assisted target identification system. But the broader purpose was that Project Maven was a pathfinder. It was a vehicle for which commercial AI could be integrated into the U.S. military at scale. See, the innovation here was that DoD saw that the best capabilities could not be generated in-house, and it's a waste of time to try to do it. Because for years, the CIA, NSA, and like other intelligence agencies had built in-house bespoke capabilities using machine learning to like do all this anti-terrorism stuff. But DoD just like they took the leap and they reached out to commercial tech to help out, and in doing so, kind of changed everything. So Google won the contract to do this, and I think the first system was using TensorFlow to make this system for them. But inside Google, and remember, this was an intensely activist time. There were protests and there were walkouts on a number of issues, including this one. And many Google employees did not want their company working with the military, as you saw in the letter in the beginning. And they actually succeeded in not having Google renew the contract with DoD after about a year. And at the time, this was hailed as a huge victory for the grassroots activist community in Silicon Valley. But I think the more significant thing that happened was the public debate in Washington and Silicon Valley about the relationship between tech and the military after Google dropped out of this. So you started to see more like op-eds and papers on this topic. You know, there was and still a very idealistic core in Silicon Valley and tech in general that just wanted the work to do good for humanity and not result in any pain or suffering. That tech should not be used for war. Like that's kind of the general gist of the mindset. But then you had arguments from the other side. It was a healthy debate. You had arguments on the other side, and you know, pointing to the new reality. This one was a super well-known op-ed written by Peter Thiel. Good for Google, bad for America. In it, basically, I'm just going to read this passage out loud. AI's military power is the simple reason that recent behavior of America's leading software company, Google, starting an AI lab in China while ending an AI contract with the Pentagon, is shocking. As President Obama's Defense Secretary Ash Carter pointed out, if you're working in China, you don't know whether you're working on a project for the military or not. No intensive investigation is required to confirm this. All one needs to do is glance at the CCP's own constitution. Xi Jinping added the principle civil-military fusion, which mandates that all research done in China be shared with the People's Liberation Army in 2017. That same year, Google decided to open an AI lab in Beijing. According to Fei-Fei Li, the executive who opened it, the lab is focused on basic AI research because Google is an AI-first company. We're a world where AI and benefits have no borders. All this is a part of a huge transformation in humanity itself. Back in the United States, a rebellion among rank-and-file employees led Google last June to announce the abandonment of its Project Maven contract with the Pentagon. Perhaps the most charitable word for these twin decisions would be to call them naive. And I think, to be fair to Silicon Valley workers, I think their feelings were with the majority of Americans at the time, which was just sick of almost 2 decades of war. And they didn't want to be involved with, you know, what they saw as U.S. imperialism. But on the other side, you know, and this is what happens when you transition from one epoch to another. You went from the war on terror era to the geopolitical competition era. And on the other side, there was a threat of China surpassing the U.S. and the implications of all that. And it's really hard to argue that like a Chinese CCP-dominated world would be better for human rights and the values that Silicon Valley's represented. The debate affected a lot of people in Silicon Valley because it was very public. And it actually drove the motivations for like a generation of people who disagreed with how Silicon Valley treated this. This article is from pretty recent, but it gives you an idea of what happened during that time. Specifically, yeah, I mean, this guy was talking about, he told me that Google's overreaction was a watershed moment that spurred others in the industry to return to working on defense and warfare. So the start of Silicon Valley defense tech could be traced at this time. The rise of the current generation of defense tech startups such as Anduril, Shield AI, Rebellion Defense, and Skydio can be traced to the 2017-2019 period surrounding Project Maven. These firms built on groundwork laid by the DIU and attract engineers who were disillusioned by Silicon Valley's monoculture and motivated to work on national security challenges. So this is a bit of a tangent, but jumping forward a little bit more in time, I also want to go a little more in depth to explain how the Silicon Valley elite aligned with Trump and how different it was during the first Trump term. Like during the Biden administration, the head of the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, was Lina Khan. Essentially, the FTC's job was to make sure the US markets are competitive and to limit the power of monopolies, make sure they don't develop. So Lina Khan took a very aggressive interpretation of this and aggressive stance towards the tech industrial complex. Essentially argued that like the practice of tech giants buying startups was a monopolistic practice. And under her, the FTC sued a bunch of tech giants. So the effect kind of was, this turned the entire tech industrial complex against the Biden administration, the Democrats. You know, the VCs didn't like it because it undermined their business model. The big tech companies didn't like getting sued. There were a lot of supporters for her in the rank and file among the actual workers who saw, you know, Lina Khan as a champion of the average American. I mean, I personally like Lina Khan also. And another factor behind what led big tech to line up behind Trump. Now, this is one interview from Mark Andreessen, who is a powerful conservative VC figure. And in this interview, he talks about how the Biden administration dealt with VCs and with big tech in terms of AI. I would fact check this. I don't know. There might be other opinions out there, but I'm not really sure. But this is pretty compelling. Okay, so I'm just going to read a bit of this. Now he's talking about how he went to Washington with some other VCs and they couldn't get a meeting with Biden, but they met with their senior administration. We basically relayed our concerns about AI, and the response was, yes, the national agenda on AI. We will implement it in the Biden administration during the second term. We are going to make sure that AI is going to be a function of 2 or 3 large companies. We will directly regulate and control these companies. There will be no startups. This whole thing where you guys think you can just start companies and write code and release code on the internet, those days are over. It's not happening. So Mark Andreessen said, we were shocked and that it was even worse than we thought. We said, wow, that seems very radical. We said, honestly, we don't understand how you're going to control and ban open source AI because it's just math and code on the internet. How are you going to control it? And the response was, we classified the entire area of physics during the Cold War. If we need to do that for math or AI going forward, we'll do that too. Which is, it's a little bit of a strange interview just because the cutting edge frontier is not open source. So it doesn't make too much sense. But the overall vibe of the interview is that like the draconian authoritarian control of the Biden administration basically drove big tech to line up against Trump, who did not have that point of view. So it's in this context, in the aftermath of the Maven protests, the rise of defense tech startups, and that the release of ChatGPT in November 2022 happened. So remember, by this time, the DIU was established in 2015, so it existed for 7 years, and it went from like kind of just a place that's kind of bridge 2 worlds into a super well-functioning organization that effectively functions as the bridge between Silicon Valley and Washington. Recognizing the need of the viability of military use of LLMs, in August 2023, DoD established Task Force Lima to study generative AI capabilities. Now, keep in mind that this is like August 2023. ChatGPT was released November 2022. Like, this is not even a year. In government speed, this is super fast. And this can only happen if there's real proper infrastructure built. Like all the work that was done before, it allowed them to seize this moment and do this. So basically, Task Force Lima's job was to solicit all the military branches in the US military of possible use cases for LLMs. And then they ran experiments and developed minimum viable capabilities to pretty much prove them during active training scenarios. Task Force Lima was sunsetted in December 2024, and in January of this year, 2025, DoD stood up the AI Rapid Capability Cell, called the ARC, which was one of Task Force Lima's recommendations. The ARC basically identifies and develops frontier AI opportunities for delivering warfighting capability and enterprise management. It's in this context that we started to see a bunch of announcements on frontier AI deployments into the US defense space. November 2024, Meta announces they're going to let Llama be used by US national security users. This is when Meta also announced a collaboration with Lockheed Martin. Anthropic and Palantir announced a partnership to bring Claude models to the AWS for national security users. In December, OpenAI and Anduril announced a partnership on drones, like kind of to sort drone sensor data. And just this summer, early summer, Anthropic launches Claude Gov for national security customers in the US. And this is when the 4Tech execs joined the US Army under Detachment 201. And just not even 2 months ago, DoD announced contracts, $800 million to OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and xAI to develop and prototype advanced AI systems, including AI agents. So what are the implications of all this? Basically, the US civil military fusion is here. The US was always jealous of Chinese civil military fusion, at least those in the defense space, in how efficient it was, even if they disagreed with the level of state control. There used to be a saying in the US defense circles, it was like, China has civil military fusion, we have civil military confusion. But essentially I would argue this sets up the US to be the most advanced AI military in the world, because the pipeline from Silicon Valley prototype to DoD deployment is pretty much cleared. I mean, there's a lot I don't know. There's only so much in open source, but it seems like I would argue that there's no other military in the world. First of all, no other country in the world has access to what the US has in terms of frontier AI, but I don't think anyone has done the work that they have done in terms of this direct linkage from tech to the military. I don't know what China's doing on this. They've been doing it far earlier, but their civil military fusion style is top down. The American civil military fusion style is at least equal, so it's a very different style. I would argue that this is a strategic force to be reckoned with, not so much because of what it is now, because of what it become over time. With this system in place, it will go further and develop through many changes, but especially if you imagine something happening with China in South China Sea or another area in the world, which actually really ignites the US defense system more so than it is today, you can see that the groundwork is laid for a lot of development. And this is outside the scope of this presentation, but I haven't even discussed how the Ukraine war fits into all this, but that also had its role in developing this as well. But the deeper implication is that US military and frontier AI companies will co-develop cognitive infrastructure together. This means they're going to define the AI systems through which military thinking is done. This is decision-making, information processing, strategic foresight, and how thinking is augmenting and shaped. Especially as frontier AI companies develop agentic systems for military use, their internal policies, evaluations, systems of control, they will have direct bearing on military doctrine. There is no historical parallel to this, where Silicon Valley's thinking can have such a deep impact on military doctrine. This is the first. In terms of geopolitics, integrating frontier AI into the US military basically boosts US hard power. It gives the US military advantages in sensing, logistics, intelligence, and warfighting, especially when combined with autonomous systems, which the US is working hard to produce a lot of. For allies of the US or people thinking, or countries thinking that they want to be allies with the US, it offers additional capabilities and incentives for partnering with the US. For adversaries, it poses an additional degree of deterrence and motivation to quicken their own AI integration. I'm sure that they're working hard in China right now to this right now, and this is just an example. NATO this year, this was just from April, NATO acquired the Maven smart system, which was, so after Google dropped out of Project Maven, basically it was picked up by Palantir and other contractors, with Palantir being a star role. It actually built out a lot of Palantir's company. and now it is an entire suite of military AI tools, and it was picked up by NATO recently as their like go-to contract for like battle space management, I think. And finally, we get to AI safety implications, which is why you're all here. Long story short, I know this is an AI safety hub, but this is where my thinking kind of it's the least developed in. Also because probably will just take time for this to gestate. But you know, my preliminary thinking is that the loss of control scenarios will be directly worked on by U.S. military officials. And on the one hand, I think that's a good thing because their standards for testing and safety is high, given like the years of like rigorous testing and dealing with complex legal issues and loss of life, and like they're serious people doing this. On the other hand, the thought of military using AI agents from everything from logistics to battle planning to like controlling drones is like profoundly scary. So that's pretty much it. I would pose a question to the group. What do you think the AI safety implications of this are? And yeah, that's me. That's my LinkedIn. That's my article. If you want to follow me, watch it, or you know, go to the website or something. And yeah, that's it. Questions, comments? Yeah, that's right on. Oh, sorry. Hope I get this right. The question was, what am I concerned about in terms of the specific examples of AI in the military, like hard examples, and am I concerned about, and what about the question of manufacturing, which is just as large as AI? On manufacturing, I would agree with you, and I would say that the U.S. is far behind China on a lot of stuff. The U.S. manufacturing has better, exquisite systems, but basically, since the Ukraine war, there's been a focus on drones and what's called small-scale attributable systems, like systems that you can send out to get blown up. It's good if they come back, so you don't have to make a new one. But if they get blown up, it's okay. And it's like a bunch of these small, cheaper systems, and you see them used effectively, like by the Houthis in the Red Sea and the Ukrainians to fight the Russians, and the Russians back in the Ukrainians. So this paradigm is from high-cost exquisite systems to like low-cost attributable systems is a thing that every single military is adapting to, including the U.S., including China. And when it comes to manufacturing, you can't undo the past, and China has built out their manufacturing base over 40 years, which pretty much serves the entire world's digital economy needs. And a drone is basically a flying 3D printer, you know. So it's like the same infrastructure supplies that, and China far surpasses U.S. in military arms sales in drones. It's been a couple of years since they've done that. So this is the problem the U.S. are scrambling to figure out. With regards to military AI specific usages, there's like, as you can probably guess, there's not a lot when you're looking up like articles on the internet on this. It's pretty secret. I would guess that as of right now, I would say the military probably there's a risk tolerance. You don't want to deploy this thing in a situation or it can endanger lives. You want to give it some easy stuff first. So like I would say they're probably focusing on like kind of nuts and bolts, mundane military stuff like logistics, like you know, an army healthcare, or like footage recognition, like the Project Maven. I don't think they're letting it control weapons yet. I think there might be some stuff on stitching together sensor data and battlefield management, which is what the Israelis have used it to do, which is what the Ukrainians have used it to do. Ukrainians have a system called Delta, which is basically an AI-assisted battle space management that gets all sensor data from everywhere, whether it's a camera or like a microphone or like a random person texting the hotline that I saw a drone and putting it to one easy to use space. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that we've already started to see AI in drones in Ukraine because in Ukraine the drone warfare is so intense there that like and everyone uses electronic warfare to jam each other's drones so they can't see like the FPV pilot, like the first person view drone that like personally pilots the drone to the target, like they jam that signal. So they've started having drones that are AI powered that can actually navigate once the connection to the pilot is lost and like find the target. I'm not an expert in this, so I don't really know how far that's gone, but I think it's very early days. I think we are still in the beginning of AI in the military in terms of controlling like robots and actual weapons, but yeah, a lot of secret, of course. Anybody else? My man, Sonny. Thank you. Hmm. The question is about. Thanks for the question. The question is about the there has been a decline in recruitment in the U.S. military, and how will AI impact that? Short answer is I don't really know. I'm not an expert on that stuff. But my instinct is to say that um, I think a lot of people in defense circles and national security circles feel that we are in a pre-war period right now, and we're like in the 1930s, early 1930s, and and I think a lot of people feel like a conflict is coming, and I feel like recruitment will probably rise. We discussed a lot of societal and geopolitical and epic large scale changes across the world, and I feel like we are in a time of change right now, and I feel like recruitment is one of those things that will go up and down depending on specific things that happen. So I think that that problem could solve itself for the U.S. military. Anyone else? Yeah, please. Hmm. Hmm. The question is, thanks for the question. The question is about how I think that AI could affect like the more like hybrid style war, which is like what they call gray zone tactics, which is like using influence operations or disinformation or like things like that to like shape the conditions of battle. Um, I'm not an expert in cyber, but like AI in cyber is like its own topic. There are a lot of AI in cyber. Um, there's AI and misinformation, and with deep fakes and interference in elections. I think China's been using a lot of AI in the interference in the last Taiwanese election. Don't quote me on that. That's what I heard. But I think that AI. I think it's just like everything on the internet. AI is just going to be a big part of it. And like I think recently, I only heard this week that Anthropic reported that they detected North Korean agents using Anthropic, using Claude to generate like sphere phishing campaigns or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, it's going to be everything is just going to get more fierce with AI. I think it's just going to be like everything. Instead of like um, 10 misinformation specialists, you just need one. He can do all the Claude can help you out and do the rest of the misinformation. So, anyone else, please? Hmm. Thank you for the question. The question was about what is the U.S. military doing that I know of to mitigate loss of control risks and other like mitigate the risks of AI in general. Um, I'm not sure, honestly. Although I gotta say, yeah, this is one point I neglected to bring up. Like the fact that the U.S. military is now at the forefront of agentic AI now. Like I don't know the difference between the models that the big companies are going to develop for you like commercial users versus military users. Is it like what's going to be the difference between the two? But having the U.S. military at the forefront of this, it builds upon a history in the past couple of years of like national security and AI safety intersection. Eric Schmidt, who was like a former like Google exec, that he was actually one of the key figures to bring together Silicon Valley and Washington in the 2015-2025 era. He has a think tank called the Special Competitive Studies Project, which they came out. I think they came out with uh, a bunch of papers about like the AI Manhattan Project. I think the super intelligence strategy was written by him, or like he was involved in it somehow. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I also remember he had a paper about mutually assured AI destruction, where it was basically applying the mutually assured nuclear destruction concept to AI and how it could be like applied to basically dueling powers that are approaching AGI and how they could sabotage each other. So they're in best interest to have an agreement. So like, I think the good news is like there has been thinking in national security circles on this so far. I'm not aware of the impact it's had on national security circles. I'm not aware of the impact it's had in defense circles. Um, yeah, that'll be that should be a subject of another entirely different presentation. Now that we got this one, this was like fundamentals 101 presentation. Thank you, Catherine. Great question. The question is America wanted to establish like a unipolar world again with American AI and American dominance? Um, well, Trump certainly does. That's very clear. Um, I personally think that I think their primary objective right now. Short answer, yes. I think just the belief that the first two AGI will have unimaginable advantages economically, militarily, in every way over everyone else, and the first one there will uh, dominate and maintain the unipolarity, which is not like throughout its history since becoming the global power after the Second World War, there have been multiple challengers to the U.S., multiple ways that U.S. Military power was challenged, at least in terms of military power. Like the turn back to AI was one element called the third offset strategy around mid in like 2015. Like the first offset strategy was to basically prevent the Soviets from expanding further by developing nuclear weapons and launching this like Cold War. And this, I think the second offset strategy, which was I think during the 90s, don't quote me on this because I'm drawing this from my head, um, was to basically, despite the fact that they were at the height of the Cold War, they were numerically inferior to the Soviet Union, develop like a ability to counter them through developing like super precise precision munitions, and that's how they looked at how they deterred the Soviets at that time. And now I think the strategy is on deterring the Chinese by developing super good AI as one element of it. And I think there's like a lot of overlapping stuff here. I think overall they are after dominance. I think every global power worth their salt is after dominance. Really, I think that's just a natural systemic. You don't get to be number one without trying to be dominant over everyone. But I think their immediate interest right now is in preventing any Taiwan problem in 2027. I think that's what everyone's working to right now.
seem to focus specifically on AI so much, but he reads Trump basically as a clear example of not pursuing that strategy because he's trying to like very openly giving out that world police agenda the US is going on, but like dumping its allies and being like, you on your own, figure out your own stuff. Basically leaving the Asian realm to China and just focusing on establishing a secure enclave around itself.
Very good point. So Catherine brought up there's like a podcast where someone argued that like Trump is now kind of relinquishing America's world police role and kind of letting allies kind of work it out for themselves in their own countries, including the Asia Pacific, where he might leave like powers that are kind of I guess opposite, like antagonistic to China, like South Korea, Japan, Australia, to their own devices. I guess I would argue that he's done kind of both. Like if you looked at Ukraine, like he was going to leave them completely, and now he's giving them weapons. So it's like you can't really take what he says as you have to take what he says with a grain of salt. But overall, the overall structure of U.S. engagement with the Indo-Pacific and with partners there, like if you look at actually like the defense agreements that have been signed and like the visits that have been made between all these generals and defense ministers, there is still the deepening of U.S. cooperation in Indo-Pacific with their partners there, like in like Philippines, Vietnam. Well, Vietnam, not sorry, Philippines, like Australia, Japan, South Korea. Those things have deepened. That said, you got a point there because like for a long time the U.S. wanted to have India as kind of like a counterbalance for China, and they were like actively seeking to like court them and like raise them up. And then Trump just came in and slapped like all these tariffs on them, and now India is mad at the U.S. So like Trump's kind of reset of international relations based on his feelings, like kind of put a wrench in the thinking of all U.S. national security apparatus people. So I would say that. You never know. Yeah, I don't really know what's going to happen in the next future. But the indication, I think even Trump knows that, like, if you just abandon the Indo-Pacific to China, eventually it's going to come to your doorstep. And my theory, my personal theory, why Trump was talking about 51st state and taking Greenland and everything. My personal theory is that that was all to secure the Arctic against China. My theory is that Trump does identify China as the main adversary and is doing everything in his power in a crazy way to give the U.S. the advantage back. I mean, look at why the tariffs are there in the first place and the attempt to bring U.S. manufacturing back to America. This is to address the fact that the manufacturing base was given over to China after the mid 1990s. In my opinion. So Anson. Thank you, Anson. So the comment was maybe this is not so new because like DARPA basically is a DARPA project that led to the creation of the internet and like other technologies. And the second point was that the natural conclusion of this should be the nationalization of kind of this like super complex, and like it's going towards nationalization, and that it could lead to a AI Manhattan Project. So I'll address the Manhattan Project thing first. I don't know how things are going to go with the AI Manhattan Project. I would definitely say this sets the stage for that thing to be more possible now because of the familiarity between people in defense and in frontier AI companies. But let's remember that the frontier AI companies still work on their own like commercial business interests, and like they're a delicate ecosystem. If you mess with it too much, you might break it. You know, like going back to China, one thing I read after the release of DeepSeek was like, okay, now they made a name for themselves and they've done China proud on the world stage, and now the central like organs of the Communist Party are like now like, okay, these guys are great, but are they going to mess it up by like putting their fingers in things? Do they know? Does this authoritarian government with an urge to control know that sometimes it's better to just let things be and let them do their own work? You know, and so there was a question of whether greater attention by the central powers in China would actually harm Chinese AI. And I would pose the same question on the U.S. I would say if you had a centralized Manhattan project, could you do it in a way that it actually facilitates all the things you want and discourages the things you don't want, that are characteristic of centralized government control? But again, as I would say before, like the fact that you are seeing a bridging of the gap between Silicon Valley and Washington makes this thing much more possible. And after a couple of AI incidents and maybe a war or something, like you never know, it might, this political situation might come that this actually arises. So that's the first question. Second question, or the first question about is this actually new? I would say the scale is new, and I would say that in the invention of the internet, is it called ARPANET that was invented? That was a predecessor for the internet. ARPANET, like it was a technology that was developed to like basically retain communication after nuclear attack, but then it was kind of given over to commercial sector for them to run with, and the U.S. was kind of, the military was hands off after that. So I think DARPA has always maintained a connection to Silicon Valley and tech in some way, but this is another beast entirely. This is like, we are reaching out to large commercial firms. I would say the closest equivalent you can have to this was during the British Empire, and they had the East India Company, and that was basically a function of the British Empire. That was so important in the British Empire. I would say this is probably the closest historical equivalent, although I could probably do a paper just examining that. Anyone else? All right, Marty, you want to say some words? Thank you guys very much.
All right, thanks again, Jason. Thanks everyone for attending. That's all for today for our main talk, but everyone who's here is welcome to stick around for a while longer. You can hang out for another hour or so and until we kick you out. Put yourselves to pizza, and yeah, thanks again for coming. If you want to, keep track of Jason, he's right here, and yeah, I would suggest you go ahead and read the article. Thanks again.